Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you, wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat Saeed Khan. I'm a journalist based in New York City, covering Pakistan and the rest of South Asia. Now, considering that most of my work is in Urdu, I have started to delve more into a larger regional pan South Asia, uh, uh, I guess you can say, trend analysis of what's working. And on that, I've started reading more and more of Foreign Policy's South Asia Brief. It comes out in the middle of every week. Foreign Policy is one of my favorite magazines. And because, of course, that's where I'm from and that's where my interest lies, I cannot ignore, even to the best or worst of my intentions, the author of the brief, who happens to be a dear friend and colleague and always my go to wingman for anything that is associated within the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Michael Kugelman, our resident South Asia Wala, the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. Mike, welcome back to my show. It's good to have you back after almost a month.
Indeed, yes, it's been too long. Great to be back here with you.
All right. So, Mike, let's just recap. In the last month, the last time you and I talked, the Pakistani diaspora and its political action groups had successfully lobbied the US Congress to pass a resoundingly majoritarian resolution about Pakistan's elections, which it deemed as worth investigating independently. It had also, very importantly, demanded more action on civil rights and democracy in Pakistan. Now, I remember the last conversation we had, we war gamed about where this could go, and you were pretty skeptical that you was like, basically, you were like, Waj, these guys can maybe get a resolution, but making it more actionable in terms of sanctions, etc., that's a very different haul. And I think your analysis is on point. We haven't really seen much action since then, but what I really want to concentrate on starting today is what's in the news these days in Pakistan, and it's the ban, the potential ban on the PTI, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the largest political party in the country, Imran Khan's own. But the ban, while it's being discussed in Pakistan, and of course it's controversial, there has been discussed in Washington as well, which is where you reside. Just a couple of weeks ago, when word on the street hit DC, the State Department spokesman said, and I quote, that banning any political party would be a matter of great concern. Now, the ban is potentially still on the table. The military is demanding that Khan apologize. That's basically, it's looking like the single point agenda that the military wants. They want him to apologize about May 9th, which were these massive riots which took place last year. But all of that aside, let's just concentrate on what the mood in Washington has been since this particular news item, a ban on a political party, the largest one in the world's fifth largest country, is now on the agenda officially in Pakistan. How are Washingtonians taking this?
Right. So, as I've told you, as we discussed before, there's always the important broader context that there's always so many other things going on from Washington's perspective that are so much more important than anything happening in Pakistan, no matter how significant it may seem there. But now that's particularly salient. Washington is very busy. As we know, there have been major developments with the presidential campaign. And when it comes to foreign policy, there's so much going on in the Middle East, among other places. But getting to your question, those in the government and those outside the government too, in DC, that focus on Pakistan, continue to be very concerned about these trends that have been playing out in Pakistan for quite some time. The most recent one, which indeed is seen as a very concerning thing. I mean, I personally see this vow to ban PTI as a blatantly autocratic move, right? I mean, you talk about Pakistan trying to retain vestiges of democracy. That may be the case, but my goodness, this really it's just not a good look. Now, I will say that when the State Department has commented on it and indeed had said it was not a good thing, this was not a statement that was prepared by the State Department. It was in response to a question from a journalist. But we could talk about how, in some levels, the U.S. may be very cautious about how it goes about approaching these concerning developments, these concerning internal developments in Pakistan. But when it comes to this professed plan to ban PTI, I think that you had some pretty strong words from the State Department spokesperson. But I'll end with this. My sense is that the U.S. government, like so many other observers, assumes that it won't actually come to something, and that the courts, whether the Supreme Court perhaps, will eventually make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the Pakistani leadership, the civilians, the military, whatever, to ban PTI. And I think that would be a good thing from a U.S. perspective, not just because you wouldn't have the ban come through, but it would reduce the possibility that the U.S. government will be put in an awkward position where it has to act, where there's going to be more pressure on it to come out and say more about a move as draconian as that would be.
Right. So you don't think that anybody's buying whatever the narrative sellers are selling, that this is actually going to happen? Do you think this is just brinksmanship then? Is that how Washington is reading it? This is just brinksmanship from the Pakistani government? This is like local politics? What is this? I mean, clearly the State Department didn't give a prepared statement, but just saying it's a matter of great concern. Do you think that forced the Pakistanis to maybe draw down from where they were at regarding Khan?
Good question. I don't know. I don't know for sure, but I think that all of us, whether me, outside analyst, or U.S. government officials, everyone that looks at Pakistan knows that there's been this ongoing tussle between the army and the judiciary,
Right.
and that it's important to look at this new threat to ban PTI in that broader context. It seems like it was a direct response to the court decision to bring back those reserved PTI seats. And we have seen, we've seen the courts rule in ways that benefit PTI, and we've seen it rule in ways that don't benefit PTI. But in this particular case, we know that the Supreme Court recently had described in a ruling PTI as a political party, as a legitimate political party. So that suggests to me that that the courts would make it very difficult,
Right.
for this threat to actually go through. And I would think that those in the USG, I mean, I haven't specifically asked folks this question, but I would think that they would see this in a comparable way, just because the trend has been that, to an extent, the judiciary has been a check on the actions, one could call them excesses, taken by those in power in Pakistan over the last few years.
Right. Now, I know your brief covers a bunch of topics, Mike, and I know you really start off with the Quad. That's, of course, the Aussies, the Americans, the Japanese, and the Indians together, because that is where the Indo-Pacific theater is where America's interests lie in terms of global security and national security. I don't have the wherewithal or the time to follow up on the Quad, but I know this isn't in your brief for this week because it just happened. Ismail Haniya is dead right next door in Iran. Now, I know it's a bit of a stretch, but work with me here. The Pakistanis share a huge border with Iran. The Pakistanis have exchanged missiles with Iran just earlier this year. In fact, they're not really warm, but they're not really cold. It's a sort of a weird, lukewarm sort of relationship, which is positioned on Pakistan's all-out support for Iran's regional nemesis, the Saudis. And of course, Pakistan's proximity to Iran's great enemy, the United States. But premised on all of that, that's the logic context. The Pakistanis have been fighting off some members of the so-called Axis of Resistance. We've heard of them off late, the Fatimiyun brigades, the Zainabiyun brigades. In fact, from my hometown in Karachi and Quetta, where a majority of these guys are inducted by Iranian intelligence and recruited because those are high Shia population cities, there's been a lot of action by local law enforcement, by the CTD, by the ISI, etc. Now, I don't want to get you into the hyper-local bad guy bashing and counterintelligence world, which I follow within Karachi and Quetta, but just draw it out for me from a Washingtonian perspective. What are the Pakistanis doing right now, sitting right next to the Iranians? War drums are beating right next door. I know it's a really porous border, but really the Middle East ends on the Sistan-Balochistan border. It ends there for lots of countries. It ends there, but it doesn't end there for CENTCOM, which is Central Command, which is where the action will be out of Florida when push comes to shove in terms of escalation of war. What do you think the Pakistanis are thinking right now, both in terms of local counterterrorism and regional developments? Do you have any picture you can draw out for us?
Yeah, that's a great question, and can't overstate how important this assassination is for not just the geopolitics of the Middle East, but indeed South Asia as well, as a country that borders Iran and has a complex but significant relationship with Tehran. And one of the last foreign visits that the Iranian president made before he was killed in the plane crash was a long trip to Pakistan earlier this year. So, I mean, to be quite honest, I would think that Pakistan is hoping that somehow, somewhere, at some point, all of this craziness in the Middle East dies down. I mean, this is not what Pakistan needs, given that it's dealing with so much internal turmoil because of its economy and political tensions and upsurges and militancy. It's dealing with increasingly, and we talked about this before, it's dealing with hot borders seemingly everywhere, right? Certainly with Afghanistan, with Iran, for the reasons that you mentioned before. Ironically, the LOC may be one of the more quiet frontiers for Pakistan these days, but not necessarily. There have been a series of attacks in India-administered Kashmir recently, which India invariably will blame Pakistan for. So it's just not a good time. There's never a good time, I think, for something like this to happen from Pakistan's perspective, but especially not now. Now, I think one thing that we have seen since that landmark deal concluded by Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by the Chinese some time ago, is Pakistan trying to very slowly, carefully see what it can do to increase its relations with Iran. I think it sees that Saudi-Iran deal as an opportunity, that it gives Pakistan more diplomatic space to explore better relations with Iran. At the same time, Pakistan is sort of in this straitjacket, so to speak, in the sense that it might still feel constrained by its close relationship with Saudi Arabia, even though that deal with Iran might give it more diplomatic space. But there's that, but also, Pakistan wants to get things right with the U.S. Let's be very clear. I mean, this current leadership really wants to get that relationship with the U.S. in a good place. And so Pakistan has to be very careful how it deals with Iran. It has to be very careful how it trades with Iran. There's been more talk about the dilemma with the Iran-Pakistan pipeline. Pakistan claims it's going to find a way to pay for it. If it doesn't, Iran has threatened to take it into court and sue it for huge amounts of money. Mm-hmm. So all this is to say that Pakistan doesn't have any interest in things getting any worse or more tense, more escalatory in the Middle East, including in Iran. Now, I was concerned. I'm glad you didn't go there. There have been some ridiculous, quite frankly, conspiracy theories about who might have been involved in the assassination. Some have made the allegation that India was involved. Some have made the allegation that Pakistan was involved.
I heard.
This is absurd.
I heard.
This is utterly absurd. Yeah. So, but no, I think that your point, and in all honesty, you're very reasonable. You wouldn't throw that out there. But I just think that every day there's a new fire.
But serious foreign policy officials in Pakistan and very senior retired officials have thrown it out there. Abdul Basit, the former ambassador to India, he was a hotshot in his day at the Foreign Office. I expected better from him. He said, "Oh, it looks like there's Indian fingerprints. Remember Kulbhushan Yadav? The Indians have foreign agents in Iran, and clearly there must be an Indian connection." I thought was quite absurd, is the right word.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, both Pakistan and India. For both Pakistan and India, any involvement in any type of situation that further destabilizes the Middle East is not in their interest at all. So right. Anyway, yeah, sorry we're even giving this attention. But bottom line is, yeah, these developments in Iran with the assassination of the Hamas leader, very significant, very concerning for Pakistan, really because of its location and the geography, and that it can't afford any more spillover effects of this widening destabilization across the Middle East.
Okay, now quickly moving on and moving down to the meat of your brief. Now, you've also talked about the other side of the subcontinent, once known as East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. Clearly, an important region for us to study, an important part of the region for me to study in particular. You're saying that the dust has settled in Bangladesh. You also, from what I understand, you're supposed to be going there, or you're planning on going there soon. Why has this been important? The riots started, the protests started, the protests stopped. Are there any lessons to be learned? And especially uh, being a being a Pakistani, I'm quite curious. Do you draw any parallels for what's happening there versus what's happening in Pakistan?
Right. Yeah. This is such a serious crisis, and I was scheduled to go next week, but the trip is being postponed because of the situation on the ground.
Oh, wow.
Look, I mean, this is not the first time there's been a mass movement and anti-government protest in Bangladesh in recent years. But what makes this one so significant, in my view, or what made it so significant, is that it so quickly morphed from a very simple, peaceful protest against a particular policy, this decision to reinstate job quotas in the civil service, into something much angrier, much violent, and much broader, focused on these longstanding grievances against the Bangladesh government and the Bangladesh state, which include things like anger about state repression, about a worsening economy, corruption, and so on. And if this sounds familiar in terms of some of these themes we're hitting on, indeed, I think this has a lot of relevance for Pakistan. But before I get into the Pakistan um, implications for Pakistan, you're right that for now things have settled down, but not completely. You don't have, there's been a curfew in place in Bangladesh for a number of days, and it's been relaxed. There are extended breaks. Traffic has returned to Dhaka, which means things are back to normal. But you still are having protests, and the internet is still a bit choppy. I mean, there was an internet shutdown of nearly a week. Now, we talk about internet shutdown, social media interruptions in Pakistan. There has not been a nearly week-long national internet shutdown there.
Wow.
But anyway, so that continues in Bangladesh with episodic internet problems, and there's just a lot of anger in the air. Let's keep in mind that the security forces in Bangladesh were implicated in dozens, perhaps hundreds of killings of innocent, peaceful protesters. So there's a lot of anger. Now, to the Pakistan, what does this mean for Pakistan? I had said this on X some days ago, but I do think that there might be a lesson here for the leadership in Pakistan, in that Bangladesh is an example where you can have a country where the government cracks down as hard as possible on the opposition, on dissent, on criticism, and yet, despite doing that, you're not able to stop the emergence of a very large mass movement led by the public, not by political partisans, but by the public, rooted in broad, widely held grievances such as economic issues, repression, corruption. These are all issues in Pakistan as well. That, though, I think gets to an interesting question, which is something that I've thought a lot about in the past, I've even done some writing about in the past, is could Pakistan have some type of mass movement? Some people use, these sort of Arab Spring-like movement, something like that. And I think that, for me, what stands out is that there's a big difference here between Bangladesh and Pakistan. And I'm sure you would agree with me on this, that, it's easier to generate these mass movements, these nationalistic movements in Bangladesh, just because you look at the history of Bangladesh. It emerged, its independence came about through a nationalist movement. It is relatively homogenous ethnically.
Yep.
Whereas in Pakistan, the situation is very, very different, and I think it's a very divided country. I would argue that Pakistan, there's a lot of patriotism in Pakistan, but I don't know about nationalism. And I remember seeing some surveys some years ago that showed that more Pakistanis identify through non-nationalistic identities, like ethnic kin or something like that, as opposed to thinking of themselves as Pakistanis. It is important that leaders in Pakistan not be complacent about what could happen in Pakistan based on what's happened in Bangladesh. However, I think that same leadership could be reconciled to the fact that you're unlikely to see any type of really big mass movement in Pakistan for those reasons. I mean, we've seen protests playing out across Pakistan all the time. You know, right now, of course, there have been these mass protests in Baluchistan, which is not new. There have been large protests in KP in recent weeks. You know, there have been other protests over, you know, food prices or whatever the case. But in terms of a wider protest that brings the entire country, spanning, you know, transcending different provinces, ethnicities, we haven't seen that. And I think we know why. It's not a fair comparison between Bangladesh and Pakistan for sure, but I do still think it's important, you know, given that you know, a key player in South Asia is going through this really incredibly significant crisis, which has put the government there in a big quandary. And I think it's worth talking about some of the broader regional implications and what it could mean for Pakistan.
Yeah, Mike, real quickly on that, quick segue. Considering you've been covering Pakistan since I've known you, which what I've known you since almost 15 years now, roughly. That's how far back this relationship goes. Have you ever seen Pakistan in the throes of so many crises? I mean, you just mentioned the marches which are starting in Balochistan, not new, but really escalating again. You're looking at these protests turned riots, turned even what we're looking at in Parachinar recently, massacres with a ethnic as well as a sectarian shade, a Shia versus Sunni shade, and of course the regular goings on in mainland Pakistan with the judiciary and the military and the PTI and the PMLN and the PPP and everybody else. Have you ever seen, and of course, the economic crisis, which I want to quickly end the section on. Personally, have you ever seen Pakistan in your decade and a half, 2 decades of studying the region in such throes, in such a crisis?
No, I have not. And indeed, I've formally been studying Pakistan since 2007. And indeed, at no time do I recall a moment like this when you had a convergence of so many serious crises. I don't think this is unprecedented in Pakistan's history. You know, a number of analysts, I think Uzair Yunus may have been the first, have pointed to 71 in Pakistan as maybe the last time you had a comparable moment to now. But that was a long time ago. And indeed, I think it's the you know, the combination of the you know, not just the crises, the economic crisis, the resurgence of terrorism, the political paralysis, and all that, but also the, you know, the crisis of confidence in terms of the, you know, the sense that the social contract between the state and society has never been more broken. This great level of mistrust toward not just political figures but key institutions, the military, the judiciary as well, and also just how so many people want to leave. I mean, unfortunately, as you know, brain drain is a reality in Pakistan, but just anecdotally, I don't ever remember talking to so many young people from among my contacts in Pakistan and hearing so much about how they want to leave. Some have decided to stick it out. Good for them. But yes, the short answer to your question is no. I don't remember anything like this happening in all the years that I've studied Pakistan.
Right. And quickly, it's bad news. That doesn't deserve just right, but I have to move on real quickly. About the finance minister. Now, your brief mentions, and this is interesting, the choice of words that you use. You actually say right here that Pakistan pleads for debt restructuring. You say that Aurangzeb's comments came shortly after he returned from Beijing. It's notable he chose to speak publicly about delicate negotiations, but he likely wanted to signal to a wide audience about Pakistan's commitment to meeting IMF's conditions. Why is Pakistan's finance minister washing his dirty linen in public? Why did they do this? Why did they go out in public and say, well, we're struggling and we need further support? Why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, some may simply say that, well, this is a natural thing to talk about, given that he had been in China and wanted to talk about why he was in China. But I just think it's odd because, you know, there's high stakes here for Pakistan. It really needs to get that debt restructured in order to get those financing assurances. Why bring this up when it's still under negotiation? I think, you know, as I said in the brief, I think that the finance minister wanted to reach an audience that went far beyond China or other key Pakistani funders, went beyond the IMF, just to try to telegraph to the world that after all these years of Pakistan, you know, taking on IMF loans, meeting conditions, and then basically going back to what it had done in the past, and getting away from that. I think it wants to it wants to signal that it's turned the corner, that it's truly committed to do everything possible to meet these IMF conditions so that it can get the financing it needs to get its economy back in order. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. Maybe it's something more simple. Oftentimes in international affairs, there's a very simple explanation to things that may seem complicated, and maybe he was just being honest and talking about why he was in Beijing. But I just think that it's striking that he decided to get into this detail about something that one would think should be conducted. The messaging about it should be very discreet.
Yeah, I agree. What I would have appreciated is some honesty about how the private banks, which he has belonged to that network, how the private banking system is making a killing this year by through the interest payments garnered from the loans it's doled out to the government. So the industry that he represented till recently and that he has been a part of for decades is actually doing really well. Too bad he hasn't commented on that, but Pakistan's woes instead. Mike, real quickly, I want to end on, well, I want it to be a happier topic, but it's not a happier topic, but it kind of is a happy topic because it's the Olympics and everybody loves a good sport. But you have a very interesting take about the Olympics. And your take is that, South Asian countries are not very well represented at the Olympics. I mean, India has, as you've pointed out, 110 colleagues, but the other countries have no more than 7 each, including Pakistan, which I think has sent 6 athletes. These are some of the world's largest countries, and yet there's very, very little representation. And why do you think, as a fan of the Olympics, why do you think this is happening? This is 1.4 billion people in India. This is another 250 million in Pakistan. There's another 200 million in Bangladesh. That itself sounds like almost 2 billion people. Just those 3 countries. And yet we only have 150 maybe athletes. Why do you think this is happening? Can brown people not play sports?
Well, no, that's definitely not it. And I think it's not fair in the sense that, as I recall, during the opening ceremonies, there was some broadcaster, when referring to Pakistan's team, basically criticized Pakistan and said, "Look, you only have 6 or 7 athletes in your country of 250 million." But that's the trend across the region. I'm sure the ratio for India is even more significant because it's a much more populous country and it only had 116 athletes. So this is a regional issue. Look. Clearly South Asians do sports well. And if I were to ever defeat a South Asian in a cricket match, I would have to retire right away because I couldn't imagine that ever happening. And of course, other sports too. I mean, we've seen, there's so much to look at, whether you're talking about field hockey or soccer, increasingly, many other sports too. But yeah, the major sports in the Summer Olympics, and I think you could say the same about many of the sports in the Winter Olympics, these are not sports that have been big in South Asia, right? I mean, for whatever reason, the governments have not invested ample resources in them, have not been willing to create facilities, equipment that would attract more and give incentives to people to try to learn these sports and encourage their kids to do them. That's just not how it is. And so as a result, you have this very small number. And if you look at the countries that are most well represented at the Summer Olympics, right? I mean, the U.S. and the U.K. and countries in Europe and Australia and so on and so forth. Well, I mean, you look at the sports. You've got many. Track and field is a big deal here in the U.S. Basketball is a big deal here in the U.S. And so on and so forth. But as I say in the brief, there are a few interesting stories to look at here. I mean, I think that I don't know that much about him, but Pakistan does have one of the best javelin throwers in the world. Now, javelin is, correct me if I'm wrong, javelin is it's not a popular sport in Pakistan. It's not something that people spend hours talking about. But this guy's quite good, right?
Only when a javelin is a part of the police's riot gear, I think that's when we can see a lot of sticks in action. But short of that, no, not really. Perhaps in the Punjab these days, where we see a lot of dandas, as they call the javelin in Punjabi and Urdu. But no, otherwise no.
Peaceful uses of javelin, yes, it's not something that there's a lot of. But no, one of your great sports journalists, I believe it was Faizan Lakhani. He I think he said the other day that this guy Arshad Nadeem is Pakistan's most impressive sportsman of the 21st century, or something like that. That's pretty significant to say that. So, but he's not a household name because he participates in a sport that's not a big deal there. Anyway, we'll see how he does. I think that the javelin competition starts next week, so we'll see.
Thanks for keeping us honest about javelins and international finance and, of course, all things related to Pakistan and its democracy or lack thereof. Michael Kugelman, the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, with us from Washington, D.C.